with us is our buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including his, which is also available as an ebook, The Sickness is the System When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, and the host of Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff right here on Free Speech TV, democracyatwork.info, Prof. Wolff over on Twitter. And Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. There's a couple of stats here. We saw this, inflation has only slightly moderated a couple of days ago, which cratered the stock market. Now there's also the producer price index just came out a few hours ago, and it's actually declined 0.1% for August, which is wholesale. This is wholesale prices falling. And the headline PPI increased 8.7%, which is a substantial, this is year over year, a substantial pullback from the 9.8% increase in July. So it looks to me like, inflation is starting to moderate, although the Fed is talking about, or people are speculating that the Fed is talking about a 1% increase in interest rates. And then there's this piece over at Bloomberg.com by Tracy Alloway. There's a new recession canary in the coal mine, according to Morgan Stanley. And this is these adjustable rate mortgages, which became a thing, particularly after the housing crash in 2009. People started getting these, and now their interest rates are going to start going up as the Fed increases interest rates, and there's a concern that this might cause a whole new housing crisis. So what's up with inflation, and what do these numbers mean, and what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, I think I'm a little surprised by the Stiglitz article and so on, because it's a truism by now across the political spectrum that 1 month or even 2 months of statistics are too apt to need revision over time, which they usually get, and are too apt to be subject to all kinds of influences that you're not interested in, because you want to see what the kind of longer trend, what's really going on. So it is very dangerous to respond to any particular month, including this last one. There's nothing about that rule that doesn't apply anymore at this time. I think what's going on is that more liberally inclined economists, for understandable reasons, are very worried about this program of the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. That hurts poor people the most. It hurts them because they can't afford hardly anything anymore. And now you're going to make the borrowing, which is what they did to cope with the inflation, cost them more than before. I mean, they're going to be hurt by the inflation. Now they're going to be hurt more by what you're doing to so-called slow the inflation. And then their worst nightmare, you could raise interest rates and it could still not slow the inflation, just slow the economy down, and then you get the thing we call stagflation. And you've put the American working class through the second worst depression in the last 3 years we've ever had, through a terrible public health disaster, now an inflation, and you're about to unload rising interest rates. You have already done that. At a certain point, you have to begin to wonder what kind of a system subjects the mass of its people to this kind of ongoing attack. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. The second point, which is the other article you pointed out to, and that's a very important point. We have more levels of corporate debt, not so much personal debt, although that's at record highs, and government debt, which is off the chart. But we have enormous corporate debt. We've had interest rates so low that every corporation for the last 20 years that had any kind of economic problem, the quickest, easiest, and cheapest way to solve it, go borrow money, because the interest rates were literally approaching zero. Unheard of in a peacetime situation, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all borrowed up to here. What people don't know is that the overwhelming majority of those loans are at variable rates. In other words, the interest rate these loans carry varies with the interest rates pretty much that the Federal Reserve sets. So if the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, which they have been doing and which they will be doing later this month, again, the only question is how much, then it's making the burden of the debt already carried by these large borrowers even higher. Risks putting them in an impossible situation. The economy is not roaring ahead to be polite. It is limping along. Their revenues are far from soaring. But meanwhile, with variable rates, their debt is going to go up, and dramatically. That is a terrible place for the bulk of our corporations to be at. And in that situation, raising interest rates could quickly plunge a lot of them into default. That would show up in the records of what we call the index of corporate loans. And so there's this idea, let's look at that, because it'll give us a foretaste of the recession and how bad it'll be. Notice all the commentary is about an economy afflicted by interest rate rises, afflicted by inflation, and continuing, as we've discussed before, to refuse to even allow the conversation to talk about wage price freezes, to talk about rationing, which are ways of dealing with these problems that do not immediately impact the mass of people in the harsh way that both inflation and rising interest rates do.
Or a tax on windfall profits.
Which the British have done. The British have imposed a tax on the windfall profits of oil and gas companies. I mean, it's a little bizarre. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but the government is proposing to tax them. And then guess what? To use a large part of the money to give to individuals and businesses to help them pay the inflated prices. So that money will end up going right back to the corporations who were taxed in the first place. I mean, there are weird ways of solving problems, but there's a peculiar quality, the ones we have, that they tend to favor those at the top at the expense of all the rest of us, right, which your whole opus of work and writing over the years, Thom, has illustrated for us all, and we're seeing it in bold colors now.
Yeah, well, thank you, Professor Wolff. And it is so true. I mean, and largely this was brought to us by the Supreme Court that basically established oligarchy in the United States with a series of decisions, 76 Buckley, 78 Bellotti, 2010 Citizens United, that legalized political bribery. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this $1.4 trillion of outstanding mortgage loans that are variable rate. This is twice the size of the variable rate market that it was in 2015, just 7 years ago. And you know, this author over at Morgan Stanley, or this analyst at Morgan Stanley, is saying, you know, this is something that could really blow up in our faces all over again. It would be 2008 all over again. Do you think that there's a serious risk there, or did that melt down in 2008 because of the way that those loans were being repackaged and sold, basically criminally by the banksters?
Well, it's two separate problems that are linked. On the one hand, the thing blew up because you had built this edifice, this house of cards, based on the mortgage loans. And it blew up when the underlying borrowers of those mortgages couldn't pay back. And then the insurance contracts written around all of that weren't sustainable. There wasn't enough money in the system to cover all of these bets that had gone bad because the underlying population couldn't carry the mortgage. She's quite right, the Bloomberg analyst. She's quite right. That could happen again. And we have done a lot of work about the linkage between mortgages on the one hand and all of the elaborate financial instruments built on top of them. But we could still have the mortgage failure, and it would have a whole new set of consequences. By themselves, I don't know if they're large enough to mess up the whole economy. But the rest of our economy is in terrible trouble. Mortgage debt from individuals who buy a home is one thing. Variable rates also affect all those corporations that have loans at variable rates. You put together a failure in the mortgage sector with a failure in the corporate loan sector, then you have a situation where the government, which would normally come in and try to save the situation, is already in record territory of having borrowed even more than the other two players in this game, the individual and the corporation. And you're talking about debts going crazy and the ability of the system to manage it being put in question. And the minute that happens, think about all of the countries, the corporations, the wealthy individuals who have put for safekeeping their money in the United States. If they begin to see this level of dysfunction, the crash, the poor performance in controlling COVID, which is how the world sees it, then the inflation, now the rising interest rates, and the risk of defaulting variable loans, at a certain point, you're going to cross a new tipping point. And it's a tipping point in which the United States is no longer the center of the global financial universe. And how players around the world react to that, excuse me, could be as big or bigger a factor in our future. We are skating on very thin ice, and the denial of it and the pretense that we're in the good old days where we can do what we once did with a reasonable hope it's going to work out, that's not there anymore. We may be able to solve our problems, but it does not help to pretend that they're not as profound as they clearly are.
Yeah, it sounds to me like this combination of consumer debt going up and corporate debt going up is really where it goes from being a firecracker to a small nuclear bomb going off.
And the whole rest of the world is watching how we react or fail to these problems.
Yeah, I get it. Professor Wolff, thank you so much. It's always enlightening speaking with you. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. DemocracyAtWork.info. Prof. Wolff over on Twitter. We'll be right back.